Welcome back to the Horse Racing Show. Thank you for watching and liking us on YouTube and following us on Google Play and all the other places that we're on out there. And, of course, you can go to @Horse Racing Show or @Kenny Rice Sports on Twitter. With me is a longtime friend of mine. He is as good as it gets. He is not just, I don't call him a sports writer. He's a writer that covers sports. He covers human nature, human beings. He is the intrepid reporter, columnist for the Washington Post. He is Chuck Culpepper. Chuck, welcome into the show.
Thanks for having me, Kenny. Thank you so much.
Well, you know, the thing with us, we catch up, every 5-6 years, and we kind of pick up the conversation. That's what's comfortable with us.
Maybe in an airport gate or something, or, happen to run into each other or a horse track.
Well, as we did recently at the Kentucky Derby. And if you follow Chuck on Twitter, I like it. Nomad, sports writer, Washington Post, Residence Earth. I like the way you sum it up.
Is that what it says?
I don't know. That's what it said a minute ago on your Twitter. I don't know. Have you changed it? Because
no.
you are a citizen of the world. I think you moved to New York finally, but my goodness, every time I see Chuck, he's covering some event all over the world. He was in Louisville, Kentucky last week. So let me start with that. What is your impression on this, with all the sports you cover, and I don't think there's one you haven't covered, what's your impression with the way that the Kentucky Derby played out as far as your readers are going to be able to try to grasp, and the general sports world is going to try to understand how suddenly there's a disqualification in a race that annually has a lot of horses in it and usually is a fairly rough run race for somebody?
Well, it's never anytime you're at an event where something happens which has never happened before, you're kind of you're mapless, you're kind of in this lost terrain. I know I made a big mistake on Saturday, but I was just, my brain was just moving around in ways that it doesn't normally. It was so hard to process the whole thing. I think one thing it's told us about the huge amount of traffic that's gone to it on our site, on our website, and about sort of people in general, and the fact that there's much more interest in this than there normally is, even in a Derby, is that people are obsessed with refereeing. I think that, sometimes you go to a basketball game, you sit there and we get to sit at courtside, which don't take for granted, but you sit there and you hear somebody, and the only reason he's at the game is to analyze the refs the whole time. And that seems to me there's more and more such people. I'm not sure. And sometimes I sit there and I wonder, why do you even go? This is such an exercise in misery for you. And so I think that the Derby now has kind of played into that. I think maybe when people are dealing with referees, it's when they feel powerless, maybe the most powerless. It's like, I so desperately want my team to win, and here's a person who's sort of in control of whether that happens to a large degree in some cases, so. And, people will talk about calls forever if they didn't go the way they think they should have gone. So I think that's what this Derby has done, is played into that general area of human nature where and stewards are referees. They're up on the 6th floor, but they're still referees in this particular endeavor. So I think that's what's come into play here. And that's why there's so much interest, including among news editors and everything.
And with transparency, that is such to me, a throwaway word anymore. We hear politicians all the time. Transparency. As we know in real life, there's few things that are transparent, few things that people are really going to open up about. I don't care the situation. In this, with the stewards, they did issue a statement. Now, I will say this. NBC always has a camera in the stewards' room. We meet with the stewards on a regular basis before the Derby. We're well prepared. Barbara Borden, the chief steward, she was there again this year. So with all that covered, they had the opportunity to talk to the NBC people because they knew the cameras were there. They agreed on that. They knew a microphone was there if they wanted to give an explanation, not a debate, not a Q&A, but say, this is why we made the call. They issued a statement and didn't take any questions at the press conference. Chuck, in your opinion, with all the other sports you cover and getting back to the officials in other sports, do you think there's needed to be more said than just the statement about the interference as to why maximum security was taken down?
Yes, I do, and I think it would have helped them. I think it would have helped clarify some of this um, sort of speculation about why they themselves issued no inquiry and why it relied only upon the two jockeys. And maybe I've seen some talk about maybe that's because the jockeys' calls came soon enough that they didn't. But that doesn't seem to quite make sense to me. But maybe it does. It could. So, but I think it really could have helped them in several areas there. Obviously it would have helped the public, but I think it would have helped them also to to have somebody to sort of field the questions and explain some of the things that were left unexplained after the race. If you think about other sports, though, they did handle it the same way, as other sports did. We never see a referee like from the Rams Saints NFL game of last January or from say the Auburn Virginia Final Four game. We never see those people kind of brought to the press conference room and then ask questions, and that's seen as kind of part of the way the sport works, and maybe even healthy for the public that these refs sort of stay in the background and that they issue statements as happened at Churchill Downs, only to a pool reporter, which is one reporter who's assigned in case there's commentary needed from referees, but they don't go to a press conference and they don't answer questions. So it did work on Saturday the same way that it does in all the other sports we follow. So there's that to consider too.
We're talking with Chuck Culpepper, the Washington Post, one of the great writers out there who also covers sports. Do you like that? Do you like that, by the way? Because I think when they say sports writer, they think, oh, there's the fun guy. Kind of like with sports guy. Oh, there's the guy having the fun, yucking it up. I don't know. The toy department.
I'm a person who cannot handle compliments of any kind. So.
Okay.
But thank you.
No more pudding for you, Chuck Culpepper. There. As far as covering horse racing compared to some of the other sports, I mean, just the whole atmosphere like of a derby, and you covered Wimbledon, you covered World Cup. I don't know what you honestly haven't covered. Super Bowls, Final Fours, World Series, all that in there. Is there any kind of thing that connects them all that kind of weaves into that fabric of sports in general, or is that too broad a statement?
I remember going to a derby in the 90s. I'm not quite sure which year it was. And the trainer of one of the horses was a woman who had grown up in Japan. And she had been in Tokyo when the bombings were going on during World War II. And here she was training a horse in the 90s in the Derby in the U.S. She had long since moved to the U.S., I think. And she told these stories about how, she had taught herself English in the basement while she could hear the bombs outside. And I remember thinking at that time, the difference between this sport and most of the other sports largely is that a lot of times in horse racing, the people, the characters we're writing about are older. Bob Baffert's 66, Shug McGaughey's 68, Bill Mott 65. So they've already lived these lives, and also these lives in a hard game. So they have these viewpoints that are often kind of richer than those, in other sports where you're dealing, with a 40-year-old basketball coach or something like that, which nothing against a 40-year-old basketball coach, right. But, they just have a lot of times when they're willing, more to say, more experience. That to me kind of separates this. And while other sports, can have, coaches of an old age, it's Jim Boeheim is in his 70s, doesn't look it at all. But, they have other sports can have coaches like that. Horse racing just seems to have more of it. And then, you factor in the idea, another thing that differentiates it is that we don't get to hear from the athletes, just as Richard Mandela was saying last week.
Right.
We don't get to talk to our athletes. So there's that mystery about it, which actually in turn usually becomes one of its appeals.
And, what I like about your writing and all the good sports writers out there, when I talk about writers in sports, when I separate it like that myself, probably covering sports for as long as I have, I do like the people stories. I mean, there's some obvious things. Tiger Woods is a great golfer. I got that. I don't follow golf a lot. I watched intently, though, the Masters this year because of all the backstory. We know all the things he's been through. That's just one example. I love it when a writer like yourself brings out personalities and brings out situations that are far from the obvious. That guy's a good hitter. He's got a great jump shot. These are things that I kind of already know. I like to know more than that, and that's what I really like about your work. And that's kind of what drew me to horse racing. Is there's several layers to a horse, from jockey to trainer to owner to breeder.
Yeah, that draws me to it as well. And when in the beginning, when I started doing it in the early '90s, I just was, floored by that, by how many people there were involved, because I had not been around. Always watched the Triple Crown on TV and so on, but yeah, you can suddenly be following the story of a horse and run across, say, one year it was a breeder who remembers being in Germany he remembered being in Germany when the U.S. finally marched in, and and he remembers, he was telling me all about how sort of the victims. He was telling me how he didn't want history to kind of broad brush or erase what he saw when he came in, because it was real and it was awful.
Right.
So, that kind of thing, in horse racing, because there are so many connections, you can really start. There's just such a lot of people's stories within it. And often in sports, we have a hard time getting to those, and it's a person's personal choice of whether they want to share it or not. But and so if a person does want to share it, that's when you can really maybe gain some understanding that goes well beyond the sport, that helps you then understand aspects of the sport as well.
Chuck, when you show up at an event, no matter what the sport is, do you go in with some idea of what you're looking for, or you just kind of roam the grounds a little bit, the stadiums, whatever, and kind of start picking things up and go from there with your stories? Because it always interests me how you come up with these stories that are off the beaten path and so captivating.
Well, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I usually have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 ideas in mind from just reading up, that I'm going to maybe pursue. But then I always like to use this phrase, listen for the huh. It's kind of your HUH, your own huh. If something makes you go huh, then maybe you ought to pursue that. I was at the Olympics one time in Athens in 2004, and this 14-year-old diver from Malaysia got up on the board, on the platform, and at the diving competition. I thought, 14, and he was so little. And he was born in 2000, the first athlete I ever remember being born within this century. And I didn't follow it, and I regretted it later. I kind of, because he wasn't going to win.
Right.
But I kind of thought, you should have pursued that. I regretted that later. And so the Olympics last year in 2018, I was at a cross-country skiing event, where the closing finishers, the last finishers, were maybe 36 minutes or so behind, a long time behind the winner, but they were all coming. I mean, they were staggering in and collapsing onto the snow. And a lot of them were from countries that don't have a lot of skiing history, but they went and trained in countries that did, countries like Colombia and the guy from Tonga, who we all knew about, and
right.
so on. And just to talk to them after and what they felt and everything was one of the great experiences of my life. So, I love that idea that you can be at something and then run across something else that you go, whoa, that's really something. So that's kind of how it works.
How many passports have you gone through? Because I don't know of anyone who's been to more countries than you.
Well, they make you get a new one when you run out of pages.
I know.
For the stamps. And if you show up at the airport without an available stamp area,
yes,
without any available space, you can't go.
I know that. That's why I ask how many. Right? Yeah. You got to have gone, what, 3, 4? I mean, seriously.
I think it's 4.
Yeah.
They and one time I went to the United States Embassy in Abu Dhabi when I used to live there for 2 years, and they put 24 new pages in the middle. I think they stopped doing that, but that was a nice thing for a while. So I had one that went through two iterations, first as a thin thing and then as a 24-page thicker one. So that used to be, I don't think that's available anymore, as I understand
Not even for you? Not even for Chuck Culpepper, the Washington Post columnist?
it.
Jeez.
I only do a few columns. I'm mostly a staff writer. So,
well, when you're out there covering, do you have like this? Getting back to this Derby, do you think this is going to have? Do you think, in my opinion, we were talking about this earlier with some guests. I'm all for political correctness. I'm all for people treating each other as people should, regardless of anything else. I mean, I think to me that's the essence of it all. Sometimes I think it gets off on a track where it gets a little too much. Where it gets a little extreme. I'm not sure horse racing hasn't experienced a little bit of this in the Kentucky Derby for what happened at Santa Anita. Had, for example, the tragedies of those deaths at Santa Anita not happened and not been so reported and covered by people outside of the horse racing media, and the emphasis on safety, which has always been there but now paramount. In other words, I'm not sure in that long-winded statement of mine that they would have taken this horse down in any given Derby year because you kind of expect a Derby to be a rough-run race. I'm not saying that they didn't follow the letter of the law, but it's a little like, when certain places say, okay, we're going to give you 70 miles an hour, but if you go over 76, we're going to write you up. We may give you 81 next week, but this week it's 76.
Right. Right.
Does that make sense to you at all?
I had not yet given thought to that. You mean that Santa Anita could have entered the thinking of the stewards?
So much is made on horse safety. And obviously, when you look back in the super slow motion on the NBC cameras and you see the front legs of War of Will now suddenly going under the back legs of the, at that moment, winner maximum security as he comes over a couple of into the path of War of Will. And thank God, for just a second there, if they clip heels and somebody goes down, the domino effect could have affected 3 or 4 horses or more. So I understand that. When you look at that, truly, there was some danger there. It wasn't reckless on the part of Zayas, the jockey. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying at that moment he let his horse drift enough, it could have caused something. Most derbies, I believe they would have probably let that go. This Derby, because of Santa Anita and because we've heard so much talk since Santa Anita about horse safety, regulating medicine, should they use whips, all these things surrounding the track conditions at Santa Anita, that maybe that factored in. I mean, I think it's plausible that they thought, we're going to show you that we're not going to let anybody drift into paths in a crowded field because of the horse safety. Maybe they wouldn't have a year ago. It's just my guess.
I'm wondering, has something like that, I mean, we know it's happened all around the track during the Kentucky Derby. But as Bill Mott was pointing out, the stage of the race at which it happened might have been unique, and because the two horses he really affected then had maybe any chance to win was then ceased at that point. I know some people are saying, well, they wouldn't have won anyway, so which I guess is fair if you can figure that out, but it just struck me as kind of more basic. Just that he occluded 2 horses. He kept them from whatever chance they might have had, and so we'll put him behind the horses that he affected, and that was that. That was the only thing I saw there. I don't know. Maybe they have an entire. This is another question that they could have fielded that night that would have helped everybody, I think.
Yeah, no, that would make sense too. Will you be going on to the Preakness, or is it back now on the road to more sports, more countries, or will you stay closer to home than do the Preakness next week?
Well, I will not be doing the Preakness, but I will be staying on because the Derby is never going to end. The 145th Kentucky Derby.
That's why I figured you might actually be covering the Preakness, is only because of what happened at the Derby.
I think it's possible. Usually I'm based in New York. Usually we send people who are based right around Baltimore and Washington there. So I guess it's possible they would ask me to do that if it were related to the Derby. But what I do have to move on to is back to what is the topic you brought up, Tiger Woods, because the PGA Championship has moved from August to May, and it's next week on Long Island at Bethpage Black course. So Tiger won the U.S. Open there in 2002, so we'll see what happens with this.
Yeah, I think I might stay there. Wonder what we'll be talking about all next week at the Preakness. Wonder what we'll be talking about in Baltimore, Chuck, for the next 6-7 days leading up to the race.
I know. Wonder what. Wonder what.
It's so glad to catch up with you. I hope we can do this again.
Anytime. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was so great to see you the other day.
Oh, it was great to catch up with you. You know, I'm always a fan of your work and always fascinating. If you follow Chuck on Twitter, it's just, you know, where it's like, where's Waldo? I mean, where's Chuck Culpepper this week? Because I'm just stunned that you're staying in the U.S. for now, like a stretch of like 3 or 4 weeks.
I'd like to go see the Cricket World Cup in England and Wales, but I think the chances might be low on that one.
If you do, please call and explain it to me. Honestly, most sports I figure out. The cricket is the one sport I still don't get. I can follow any sport. If I can watch one sport at least once, maybe twice, I got it. I get the idea of it. I still don't get cricket, and I've tried to watch it.
I've sat through. I went to India for the final in 2011, and I wasn't in the stadium, but I was outside watching with fans, and I just, I tried to follow. But India won. I know that, because the streets were amazing. So anyway.
Yeah, that's what I learned. Always bet India in the cricket matches.
Well, they do a lot of betting there. So,
Chuck, thanks again, my friend. We'll catch up again soon, I hope.
All right. Thank you so much, Kenny.
The intrepid reporter from the Washington Post. Always read him when you can. Chuck Culpepper. And we'll be back to wrap things up here on the Horse Racing Show right after this.